Только что я с Твиттером еще общаюсь. Понимаете, если мы не в Твиттере, то мы не существуем. Это один из принципов современной реальности. И меня постоянно спрашивают, что вы там все о науке, что вы о кварках, когда же о душе. Ну что ж, отвечаем товарищам из Твиттера. С выступлением о модели реальности как источники конфликта архиепископ Оттавский в юрисдикции Православной Церкви в Америке Лазар Пухало. Прошу вас, Святой Отец. Well, you're really welcome. And probably we'll start talking a bit more about soul than about our bodies, including electronic bodies.
Well, I don't know what I'm going to talk about. I presented a paper, if you want. I've got all kinds of technical things in there. Of course, I have a background in physics and neurobiology both. But I'm not going to talk too much about those. I've heard a great deal during these days about artificial intelligence. We have artificial intelligence in Canada. It's called Parliament. And down in America, it's called George Bush. But I think Canadians are somehow, in this particular area, a little more honest than Russians, because Parliament means a place to talk. Duma means a place to think. Probably we're more accurate about it. I'm not going to be quite so technical. I'm prepared to have an Atpivanya for Schrodinger's cat because we've had enough discussion about the future. The futurology is only of value if there is a future. And I'm going to define the singularity as a confluence of compound crises on a global scale. And I'm afraid that we're handling most of those crises like Trishka's kaftan, for those of you who know the story. It's a little bit difficult to always keep looking at the mechanics of the future and what might be in the future without looking at what's transpiring today. We've come through a series of great transformations. One of those great transformations, I think my colleague Alexander Panov would call one of them a transitional phase, a phase transition. We went from the first great axial period into the second great axial period sometime in the 1600s. In the first great axial period, I think the grandfather of the period was probably Zarathustra. And by the end of the 1500s, the beginning of the 1600s, we came into the second great axial period. And that's of considerable importance to us. But since I'm going to be talking about the dangers of ideologies, in particular fundamentalist ideologies, I want to dedicate this doklad to the memory of Hypatia of Alexandria, and perhaps begin with a quote from Giordano Bruno, which has a great deal to say about our view of the future. When he said, I have no fear of barriers of crystal or of glass. Henceforth I cleave the heavens and soar to the infinite. And I think that has something to say about what happens when we make models of reality into dogmas. Well, these are the two things that really concern me and that I want to discuss a great deal at this particular time, because when I was given these two subjects, they both had to do with ideologies. Modes of future thought. Can strategic concepts move beyond ideology? And that's going to be a great struggle for all of us, because we tend to move toward ideologies, and they're always self-serving ideologies that rotate around ourselves. When we came to the point of the transition from Axial 1 into the second axial era, we moved from the mythic to the scientific. And we began to discover that the history of the universe is written in atoms. Or as we would say, the first chapter of big history is written in subatomic particles first and foremost. And we began in discovering these things to have to rethink so many of the paradigms with which we judge our own personhood, our humanity, and our role and position in this universe. When we allow ourselves to fall into ideologies, we depend on one another to try to set us aright and say, you're going too far, you're going into an ideology. And I'm not prepared to make a metaphysical abstraction out of various machines and computers and things that some people are. I think the human person still has some value in our society and our culture and in our future. And the ideologies that we form are often based in real self-interest and cruelties. But let's look at one of those ideologies and what it could cause. In 2008 and 2009 in the United States, the ghost of laissez-faire conspired together with the Rusalka of Ayn Rand to form an ideology of deregulation and the withdrawal of government supervision of financial institutions. And because it was an ideology, it had to be followed, a national ideology, and it almost completely collapsed the American economy in those 2 years. We didn't have that situation in Canada because we didn't have that ideology. And when the governor of the Bank of Canada predicted a few months ago that the United States might recover, but could never completely recover, ever. The idea of invading Iraq, Afghanistan, and these other countries is based in two models of reality and two false ideologies. One of them, of course, is the deep structural fear that permeates the American consciousness, and the other is the ideology that by invading other countries you spread democracy. And of course they resulted in a real catastrophe. And I think also when we make an ideology out of what computers and machines are going to do and what they're going to become, we're no longer involved in futurology, we're involved in ideology pure and simple. And we can curtail our identity and understanding of humanity and the human person and what constitutes a human being. These are some of the real problems that I see in what we're developing. We see the evolution in human civilizations, in human beings themselves, in technologies, and evolution is a reality that we can't deny. I remember one archbishop in Canada once saying, well, yes, you can deny it, but not successfully. And we have to look at how the human person and the human being, how we're evolving, and whether there's a spiritual dimension to it. And that was the second part of what I was asked to speak about, is can we have a synthesis of scientific theories and spiritual traditions? Well, of course, I wrote a book discussing the complementarity between our spiritual traditions and modern science. But symbiosis is a strange word. To have a symbiosis between science and spiritual traditions or humanity indicates a kind of pantheism, and also it indicates a loss of humanity. And I don't think that the future would be worth living if we degraded our humanity with all of its foibles and all of the things that are wrong with us. I don't think that we would want that kind of a future. I remember a Greek professor, Dr. Harlambos Anstal, one time looked at the pictures that they draw in the West of heavenly kingdom where somebody's floating on a cloud plunging a harp all day. And he said, if that was what heaven was like, I should prefer hell because at least it would be interesting. But what we seem to be doing is yielding our humanity, or trying to yield our humanity to machines and to some kind of mechanisms, and to really deprive ourselves of any kind of a human soul. Now, it doesn't matter how one interprets the soul, how one interprets the nous, the mind, the intellect, and the soul. We still, it's what makes us really human. And one of the things that makes us human is the things that are wrong with us as well as the things that are right with us. And one of the things that makes our humanity interesting is that we're not perfect. And it seems to me that when we're striving toward a completely machine or computer future, how are we going to determine what is actually normal when we create an artificial intelligence? Creativity and genius are just beyond the event horizon of the normal. So if we created a standardized normalcy, we couldn't possibly have any kind of creativity. We couldn't possibly move forward. And so we lock ourselves into some kinds of models of reality. And those models of reality, we dogmatize them and they become an ideology, and then they become a religion. And then, you know, if you look at the history of mankind, no one has been so proficient at persecuting and destroying other people as religious people have been. And we do it because we have ideologies. And we use those ideologies against other human beings. And we don't need to project that into the future and to strive to have humans and machines merged together, sort of a mechanical government of the universe and all these things. We probably are going to find life in other planets, other moons of other planets, and perhaps there's sentient life in other universes. I don't think we're ever going to know that just because of the distances, but it's likely true. And already passing from one era to the next, we really have a profound conflict between how we understand the human person. And for the last 12,000 years, we've been living in the Holocene era. But now we're in a quaternary era of the Holocene, which we now call the Anthropocene. We've gone through a phase transition into the Anthropocene. In the Holocene era began 12,000 years ago when we domesticated fire and made it useful. It reached its apex at Hiroshima and Nagasaki when we found out the ultimate use for fire. We could mechanize war. One of the things that concerns me at this point is that neuroscience is being used and being militarized and being used for warfare. We're coupling the human mind with the mechanical, and the human mind can control various kinds of weapons. We have a way of scanning the brains of various people to see what they're the most adept at in utilizing their mental energies toward the controlling of military devices. Most of the mechanism, most of the mechanization, most of these developments that we're all talking about in futurology have primarily military use. We're in such a confluence of crises right now that we're not resolving very well. And we're going to be hard-pressed to keep from having a global conflagration, another century of warfare and strife. And most of that warfare is going to be over water and food supplies. It isn't going to be over all of these metaphysical abstractions and things like that. It's going to be over the most basic of human needs. And those are the things that we need to focus some of our futurology on. It's not what we're going to do on the next planet up, or not what we're going to do with the next computer development. But how are we going to feed people? How are we going to have enough water for people? I mean, these are the things that we need to focus on the most. The human element is the missing dimension in most of what I've heard here during this conference. And I find that disturbing in itself because I've been in the church for many years, and one of the things that's disturbed me about religion is a kind of dehumanization by moralism. Trying to dictate the fine details of human behavior and how human beings should think. And when we start going into this Borgism, of merging man and machine together, who's going to determine what's the proper mentality or what's the normalcy for this? Who's going to determine whether there should be any kind of spiritual dimension or should not be any kind of spiritual dimension? We come to the point where we can give robots almost a self-consciousness. And when you go to Japan and you encounter some of these robots, you find yourself according to them human respect because of the way they interact with you. And it just occurs to me that we're in danger of going from the ideologies that we've escaped from the first axial era into a whole new series of ideologies that are based in the second axial era. That we've gone from the mythic to the scientific, and now we're turning the scientific into the mythic. And to keep each other from falling into these kind of ideologies, I think is one of the things we have to strive for, both in big history and in futurology. Because sometimes we get too much in love with our own minds. We start to have a romance with our own intellect. And we forget about, perhaps even forget that we're human beings, and forget about human dimensions. So if I was asked to talk about ideologies and models of reality, and how Bruno, you know, was burned at stake for violating a model of reality. He was guilty of Copernicanism, a few other things too, but Copernicanism in general. Today, the people who burned him at stake would be given life in prison in Canada, probably be executed in Texas. But so we don't tolerate a lot of the things we used to tolerate. But at the same time, we have to beware and be careful about the models of reality that we're forming. You know, when Galileo pointed his crude telescope toward the heavens and shattered forever the model of reality based in Aristotle and Pythagoras, they threatened to burn him at stake too. And he had to back down and tell a lie in order to preserve himself. You know, there's a little story that as he walked out the door, he leaned over to one of the guards and said about the earth, "Still it moves." But I can see all the possibilities in this futurology of falling into the same traps that we fell into with religion. And I think all of you would recognize those traps because they're not in your own field, they're in some other field. So, you know, I'm not going to stand and read a whole paper. I think I've said enough. But we have other issues that are more important than 2045. And one of those issues is, will we make it to 2045? One of those issues is simply, let's notice here, in the beginning of the Holocene, the CO2 levels were 278 parts per million, which stabilized our ecological system, stabilized our weather and all that, and made it possible for the human population to continue to increase. By the end of World War II, the CO2 level was up to 390 parts per million. If it keeps rising at that level, 2045 is a fantasy. Most of us, very few humans are going to be able to survive this. This is the one thing that I wish we would sometimes come down to earth about a little bit and focus on these things, because we're still cutting the sleeve off the kaftan, you know, to make it longer, and cutting the bottom off to make the collar better, Trishka's kaftan. And we're not really resolving what happens. We continue to create dead zones in the ocean by over-fertilizing our crops because we have more people to feed. How do we convince religious bodies to back off on conception control so that the population doesn't continue to grow at the rate it's growing now? By 2050, we'll have 9 billion people on the face of the earth. And what good are all the computers and all the machines and all these developments going to do when we can't feed the 9 billion people, or when we don't have fresh water for them to drink? This is really, I mean, these are big issues, and they're issues that are not really being considered too much. So we can make all the prognosis we want about the future. I'm going to find life on other planets. We know that sooner or later we're going to have to convince humanity, religious people in particular, that we're organically related to every star that lights the heavens, and to every planet, and every moon that circles every planet, and every comet that inspires our awe and wonder. We're all organically related to all those things, and we have to convince people that it's so. And that we all have a stake in this universe. But we have that stake as human beings. And human beings with all of our shortcomings and our foibles and all of the unpredictable things. You know, I mean, we talk about predicting for the future. The one thing that should give us a little humility is on Vidovdan in 1914, when a deranged Serb stepped out of the shadows and fired a pistol. All of the plans and all of the predictions and all the prophecies that people had collapsed, and we had 2 world wars. And who remembers Gavrilo Princip today? But one individual can collapse all of our predictions and all of our prophecies. And we have to take that into account also. Let's stop and think about whether we're not making an ideology out of our technology and turning it into a religion that's going to be just as destructive as all the other religions that have gone before. It has its benefits. It's always given something to the world. But religion very quickly separates itself from its spiritual roots and starts to become something else. Remember, there was Nero, Domitian, and all of these other emperors persecuting Christians. Then all of a sudden there were Christians killing Hypatia in the marketplace. And these are things that we really need to think seriously about when we start to proceed into creating these new ideologies about technology, and try to stop and think, are we creating false models of reality that we're dogmatizing into ideologies that we'll use to maybe harm or persecute other people who are not like us? So this is one of the great problems and one of the great struggles that we have within the religious world, is trying to rid people of the notion that there's us and the other. Because there is no the other, there are only variations on a theme in the great symphony of humanity. And to realize that the greatest weapons of mass destruction are poverty, fear, and hate. And that they're things we need to be working very seriously at while we're doing all this stuff with computers and machines. If you find a computer or a machine that's going to tell us how to disarm or have a treaty of non-proliferation for poverty, fear, and hate, then we'll have accomplished something very great in this world and society. And we'll have made a future that's actually possible to predict about, because it's still going to be there when we get there. That's just a few of the things that I wanted to say about. I mean, okay, the paper's got a lot of technical stuff in it too, and it's on the website. People can read it. But as I've been listening here, you know, I still get concerned that we're trying to form a dehumanized ideology of some kind. An ideology that perhaps venerates machines more than humans. And even with artificial intelligence, again, is it going to be normal human intelligence? And who's going to determine what is normal? See, I don't mind an absolute monarchy as long as I get to be one of them. And I don't mind people judging normal as long as I'm the criterion. So just to give some sober second thought to some of these ideas and some of these issues, and not to think about human beings without a soul. And we're evolving. Our brain is evolving. Our brain's actually getting smaller because we don't need parts of it we used to need in order to survive. And okay, when we think about the human condition, sexual relations, sexual breeding started with eukaryotes 3 billion years ago, and yet we make it the center of the moral thought in most religions. And it really shouldn't be. I mean, you have 2 haploids blend together for a diploid, and they share some of their genetic material. Then, as cells are wont to do, they split apart and they become haploids again. And then this has an evolutionary advantage, so they keep doing it. And then eventually it becomes part of the nature of things, and then it becomes enjoyable. It also has a lot of other benefits to it. I don't see how we can replace some of these things, though, with some of the ideas that are being put forth here. And I would just like to think about, if there was a model of reality that everything was a perfect concentric circle. And the Earth, of course, was stationary. The sun moved around the Earth. In fact, there's a website in Texas called GalileoWasWrong.org. But Texas is, the sorrow of all who joy. But it's an ideology that's very deeply ingrained. The war against science in America is based on an ideology that's only partly religious and partly part of the national mythos. And one of the great problems, of course, is all of our national mythologies. But we can form an idolatry of ideologies. And we can end up really dehumanizing ourselves. Evolution is taking place. Evolution is going to continue to take place. We're not the only place that has the anomaly of more complexity instead of entropy. There are probably tens of thousands of islands of increasing complexity throughout the universe. And all of those have some bearing on our humanity and how we understand our humanity. We're making a progress in understanding our humanity in relation to the whole universe and our interrelatedness to everything that exists in the universe. And the fact that all of our history is written in subatomic particles. And there's a great and profound beauty to that, to be part of this whole great, beautiful, wonderful thing that exists around us. But we're not machines. And we're never going to be machines. What we have to worry about now and focus on more than anything else in looking toward the future is whether any of us are going to be here when it gets here. Whether our grandchildren or our children are going to have anything to eat or anything to drink, or any earth upon which to set their feet, or any purpose for living, or any reason for living. What are machines going to give? I mean, the purpose for living is to love and be loved. I don't see how machines can do that, or how computers can do that. So, in any case, that's all what I want to say. The rest of it's in my paper.
Thank you very much.